Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of the SideswipeMMA betting podcast. This is the first edition of 2024. We're in a new year. We've had a good few weeks break from the UFC and we're back with UFC Vegas 84, which is headlined by Johnny Walker and Magomed Ankalaev's second fight, despite the first one only lasting 3 minutes and ending via an illegal knee. Before we get into that, I just wanted to let everyone know that just before the Christmas period, I posted a breakdown of all of my results of 2023, broken down into lots of different categories, basically digesting some of the data that I got from my betting performance and trying to find some ways to improve in the following year by actioning and taking advantage of some of the conclusions I might have come to. I also provided some breakdowns for some of the upcoming fights in the next few weeks because we do have betting lines for the next 3 or 4 cards. So I've picked out a few betting lines that really appeal to me. They're quite aggressive and quite big bets because I do think they are the pick of the bunch in the next month or so. So I'll leave a link to that in the comment section. Definitely check that out. I think it's still worth it. Betting lines have moved a little bit, but it still should be pretty good. But yeah, now we move on to UFC Vegas 84, which, to be honest, I think is a very underwhelming card for the first one of the year. I know it's a fight night, it's an Apex card, so it's not, going to be having a blockbuster billing that's going to, blow everyone's hair back. I understand that, but putting Magomed Ankalaev at the top of the billing is a pretty disastrous move by the UFC. I personally think Ankalaev is one of the, if not the best, light heavyweight on the planet, and I do think he will eventually end up with the belt around his waist. But he's not a very exciting fighter. He will play it safe if you give him the opportunity, and giving him 25 minutes is the opportunity. And the card doesn't get saved by any other fights. The main card itself is pretty dry. There's nothing else that really appeals to me, either from a fan perspective or a betting perspective. So personally, I'm quite disappointed. This is the first one that we're getting our teeth into after almost a month away. So to be honest, I didn't put a whole lot of time into this card. I scrolled through it and very easily thought to myself, there aren't going to be a lot of betting spots here. So before the lines moved on other cards, I thought it was much better to put my attention into the right spots. So this isn't going to be the most passionate podcast or breakdown that you've ever heard or read in your life, but either way, here it is. Let's just get into it. So as I said, this fight is a rebooking of the bout that took place on the Volkanovski versus Makhachev 2 card late last year. It lasted 3 minutes before somebody threw an illegal knee and the fight was obviously called off and declared no contest. There are a couple of things that were seen in those 3 minutes that can give us a little bit more information about how this fight should go, but mostly I do think that my breakdown from the first fight is pretty much applicable here. I'll touch on those key differences in a minute, but to break this fight down in the same way that I intended before, I just think that Johnny Walker has ruined himself as a fighter with this methodical and point-striking style that he is trying to implement since he's been with John Kavanagh at SBG Ireland. I don't really think it works for him at all. I think that he's a good at best striker when it comes to trying to win over a 15-25 minute period. And I think that Magomed Ankalaev is infinitely superior in all facets of martial arts when it comes to being the minute winner and therefore the round winner. So I said in my initial breakdown that I think if Johnny Walker wants to give himself a chance to win, he needs to fight like he did in his early UFC days when he was just like a rabies-infested fighter that wanted to kill or be killed and take his opponent's head off in the first 30 seconds. I think that's the kind of style that's going to beat Magomed Ankalaev. You're going to have to catch him. You're not going to be able to outpoint him and be methodical about it. So Johnny Walker is really in for a tough fight here, and honestly I don't think much more needs to be said. If Walker doesn't catch him clean with something and cause the shock upset, I just think that he loses quite convincingly across a longer duration period of a fight. The only differences I see in this fight compared to that initial breakdown that I gave is that the fact this is taking place in the Apex make things slightly different. Both fighters are going to have a lot less space to work. They're going to be in closer quarters, which means that the chances of a knockout are going to be a bit more likely. But again, that's kind of negated by the slow and tepid style that both men looked to bring to the table. And also on Johnny Walker's side, because he was trying to be a bit more methodical to his credit, he was investing in leg kicks early on in that fight. And leg kicks are pretty much the only weakness that Magomed Ankalaev has shown in his UFC career so far. Jan Blachowicz was able to utilize them pretty well. It's just a good way of sort of slowing him down and making him a little bit more stationary as a target, so he's easier to hit, obviously. Across a 25-minute display, it could be quite interesting to see what Johnny Walker can do in terms of racking up the damage there. I think it's going to take more than that, though, so it doesn't necessarily change my opinion massively. But those are just two little sort of caveats that I think personally should bring the line a little bit closer between the two. I believe that Magomed Ankalaev was about a 1-3 -300 favourite when they fought on that Makhachev card. And now he's up to minus 400, sometimes minus 500 in certain books, which I think is the wrong way. I think for me, it was pretty obvious that Walker showed more competence than he was supposed to be given credit for. So really, I would line it closer than that original minus 300. For that reason, I think that there's no value on this betting line. I don't want to roll the dice on Johnny Walker because I think that outside of a style that he's not looking to implement, he shouldn't win this fight at a very high clip at all. So Magomed Ankalaev is who I expect to fully win this fight. Whether he wins it via a finish or by a decision, I don't know. 25 minutes makes it a lot more unpredictable in that regard. It's just a tricky fight. It's one I'm not really interested in. It's one I didn't put a whole lot of time and effort into. And it's just one I don't think anyone can be super confident in terms of picking a method of victory for the Russian. So I just hope that Ankalaev can get through this fight, look good, and move on to bigger and better things. Because for me, he is destined to be a UFC champion one day. And I just think we should just get to that chapter because light heavyweight's in a bit of a mess at the moment. So yeah, Ankalaev should win it, but no value on the betting line. So in our co-main event, we have another rematch between Matheus Nicolau and Manel Kape, another fight that I'm pretty surprised they're putting together. I completely forgot initially that these two had fought before in Kape's second UFC fight after he lost to Alexandre Pantoja, who is obviously now the champion. It was also Nicolau's second UFC debut after he did a stint outside of the UFC. And I remember thinking that the betting line for that fight was a bit wide. I can't actually remember what line it was, but I think I took Nicolau at like plus 163 or plus 150 or something, just because I expected the fight to be a lot closer and that Nicolau is an incredibly diverse and well-rounded fighter, whereas Manel Kape's debut against Pantoja was pretty underwhelming. He was low volume and didn't really seem confident enough to be able to take the fight into different realms. I know Pantoja's a very difficult opponent. Obviously, he's the champion now, but I just wasn't impressed with Manel Kape, and I think I was right about that. Obviously, the fight did go very close. It went to a controversial split decision. I do think Manel Kape should have won, but Nicolau obviously was the one who got his hand raised. That's betting. If you see value, you should take it. I capitalised on that. But yeah, I think things have changed since then, so we are looking at a pretty different fight here, and I think that that's the difference, because there are probably going to be a lot of people who look at both of the records of each man and immediately are surprised that Nicolau is such a big price here, considering he won, albeit controversially. He was very competitive in a fight against Manel Kape just 2 or 3 years ago. But the biggest difference is that Matheus Nicolau is coming off a knockout loss to Brandon Royval in his last fight. And knockout losses can definitely change a person, especially in the lower weight classes where they don't happen particularly often. I'm conflicted when it comes to Matheus Nicolau because I was confident he was going to win that fight against Brandon Royval, and I was really rooting for him because I think he had and still has what it takes to be the flyweight champion of the world here. I think if Nicolau wins this fight and gets himself a title shot against Pantoja, he can absolutely win it because he's very similar to Pantoja. He actually might be a better point striker than Pantoja as well. He's slightly less dangerous, but he's got a lot of similar tools. But again, he's facing Manel Kape here coming off the back of a knockout loss, when Manel Kape, who has the confidence, having already shown that he probably should have been the winner against Nicolau and has really grown in his reputation in the UFC. He started throwing his weight around at press conferences. He's become a lot more outspoken on social media. He's obviously started putting some finishes together and actually becoming a bit of a respectable and feared name within the flyweight division. So I just feel like the context for this fight is completely different from how it was in the initial encounter. So really it all comes down to how is Matheus Nicolau going to look in this fight, because if somebody could guarantee me that he was going to look completely unaffected by that loss to Brandon Royval and he was going to come in and look like the same fighter who fought Manel Kape the first time, then yes, there absolutely is value on this betting line because it should be quite close. But I think that there has kind of been a changing of the guard here, and I do expect this to unfortunately be the moment that Matheus Nicolau potentially begins to take a consistent downward trend in his career. And I think that probably starts with Manel Kape, who is surging and definitely trending in the upwards direction. Another knockout win for Manel Kape would not surprise me here, but if that's not to happen, then I do think we've got a competitive fight here, and the betting line value is with Matheus Nicolau. Personally, I would line it probably plus 150 for Nicolau and minus 150 for Manel Kape. So obviously that doesn't really give me enough scope for a bet on either side because there's just not enough value on either line. So I won't be getting involved in this fight. I do think it's a very competitive fight, a complicated one to be breaking down and picking a winner. So really, I just think it's one that you should avoid. It's not one to be adding to your parlays this week because Manel Kape can very easily not look his price tag, because if this one goes 15 minutes, it should be more competitive than the minus 250 that I think he currently is. Whereas on the flip side, if he does win, he's going to look dominant in doing it because he's going to be putting his opponent to sleep. A tricky fight, not one I can really speak on much more, so let's move on. And on to the next fight, we have an exciting one between Jim Miller and Gabriel Benitez. Jim Miller is an absolute legend of the sport. I know there's been a little bit of a discussion between the likes of Daniel Cormier and others saying that he's not Hall of Fame material, but I think that when you look at the product that the UFC's been offering in the last 5 years, Jim Miller has been one of the most consistent performers in those apex prelim spots where he's taken on any and all caliber of opponents, and it doesn't matter if they're a debutant or a veteran themselves, he'll take them on, he'll do his absolute best work, and he'll put on really exciting and fights that a lot of the times have very violent finishes. So Jim Miller is exactly the kind of guy that really represents what the UFC is about these days, and I think he absolutely should be in the Hall of Fame. There's also a very confusing narrative going on with him wanting to compete on the UFC 300 card, but him riskily taking a fight very close to it, so he better hope he doesn't get damaged too badly in this one, otherwise unfortunately his chances of appearing on UFC 300 are very unlikely. So he faces Gabriel Benitez here, who is a bit of a mystery to me. He's gone into hiding in the past year and a half. We've not really seen him in 18 months. And it looks like he's put a halt on what seems to be a pretty sharp decline. He's always been a talented enough striker in my eyes, but he's gone 2-4 in his last 6 fights, and the wins have come against 2 of the worst UFC fighters we've seen in recent years, Charlie Ontiveros and Justin James. Don't really know what to say about Benitez now that he's 35 years old. It's weird to be quoting age in a fight against Jim Miller, but Jim Miller has kind of really solidly demonstrated what you're getting from him at his age, whereas Gabriel Benitez, with this time off, there's a lot more question marks regarding what kind of a fighter he's going to look at with that layoff and that age. It almost seemed to me like he's trying to stay out of competition because he knows that the matchmakers are going to use him as a sacrificial lamb. He's quite lucky that he got this Jim Miller bout, but I wouldn't be surprised if he turned down quite a lot of opponents that he was offered along the way in the last 18 months, because there are a lot of killers on the rise who would happily have taken the fight against Benitez and probably wiped the floor with him and finished him and sent him packing. So yeah, I just think that Benitez is impossible to work out because his record has kind of aged like milk, and all of his wins are against absolute nobodies in a 2024 context. But on the flip side, his losses in the UFC have actually kind of gone on to age really well. You know, is he bad enough that he can only beat the lowest of the low at the UFC caliber? Or is he now actually underrated because he hasn't really been given a chance to fight the middle of the road? It's either been the highest of highs or the lowest of lows for somebody who is on the fringe of the UFC caliber. So I just don't really know how to calibrate my opinion of Gabriel Benitez based on all the fighters he's fought. This is one of those rare times where I don't really have an opinion on a Jim Miller fight, because historically I have put a lot of money on his kind of fights because I think he's a very easy fighter to read. Jim's capabilities are no secret at all. He's basically got a 5-minute window to find a finish and then the wheels are going to fall off. He has Lyme's disease, for crying out loud. Like, he's going to be fatigued. He's not at his best anymore. He's obviously old, but he's also handicapped. That's just not a fighter that I could ever put my money on at like plus 100. He needs to be an underdog. He needs to be plus 150 at a minimum to be bettable, given the conditions that he's in. But I won't lie, he's also very dangerous in those 5 minutes, and he knows what he has to do to win, so he will be aggressive. I mean, that knockout that he landed in his last win was like sensational. It was one of the best knockouts of the year, and I'm surprised more people weren't talking about it. But yeah, I think Gabriel Benitez is a very confusing fighter, and I don't know what to expect from him here, but Jim Miller just innately is a very hard fighter to have confidence in these days. Benitez has struggled with takedowns before, so Jim Miller certainly could use that route, but he's going to have to work hard for that takedown when they're both fresh, and he's going to have to work quickly to get that submission early, because I think if this fight does hit the halfway point and Benitez is still in there, and as long as Benitez isn't looking like shit, he's probably going to turn the tide on Jim Miller, because Jim just cannot coherently put a round 3 together. I mean, Jim Miller lost the battle of round 3 against Alex Hernandez, and Alex Hernandez is one of the most notorious fighters to fall off a cliff midway through fights. He does it consistently. Jim Miller is pretty much the same. I mean, at least Jim Miller's is because he's got a medical condition. But yeah, I just think that you're playing with fire if you're trying to bet Jim Miller in a spot like this at a price like this. If you're going to play him inside the distance or in round 1 or in under 1.5 rounds, that's more of an interesting proposition, and I think possibly something worth taking here. This seems like a fight doesn't go the distance kind of fight. The line on that's probably going to be disgusting, but yeah, unfortunately no confidence in a Jim Miller fight for once. It's a pass for me. And moving on, we have Ricky Simón versus Mario Bautista, which I think is probably one of, if not the most exciting fight on the card. I'm pretty surprised that Ricky Simón has emerged as the favourite in this one, just innately from the books initial grading of the fight, and also the way that the money has actually come in on him in recent weeks. Just because he looked so bad in that main event fight against Song Yadong. I bet Ricky Simón in that one, and I was just so disappointed at how awful he looked. I know that this is a completely different stylistic match and is a different level of caliber against Mario Bautista, but it just doesn't really inspire much confidence when you look so bad on a big stage and you hit your ceiling so hard. Mario Bautista, on the other hand, is still a bit of a mystery to us. I mean, he's dropped the ball a couple of times against Trevin Jones and also in a loss to Corey Sandhagen, but I think you can kind of give him a pass for those losses. I think he quite clearly showed that he would probably win, he would absolutely win the Trevin Jones rematch, and I think he probably still would look semi-competitive against Corey Sandhagen if he fought him now. He'd lose, but he'd still look competitive. So Bautista is clearly the more well-rounded fighter here, but that's pretty much always the case against Ricky Simón. Simón is unapologetically a one-dimensional wrestler, and he's never looked any good on the feet. I mean, he got knocked out by old man Uriah Faber in under a minute, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know. But he doesn't really mind. He uses his striking as a means to an end. He wants to close the distance. He wants to use that impressive cardio to shoot an endless number of takedowns and just suffocate you. I'm not really a massive fan of Ricky Simón's style, though, because once he does get those takedowns, he doesn't have the best top control on the mat. And that's where I think this fight gets interesting. So when you look at Mario Bautista's history against grapplers, there isn't a whole lot of tape, but the last fight he had against Damon Blackshear is probably the place that you have to look. He got taken down 3 times in that fight, but Damon Blackshear is absolutely massive for the weight class, so it's, again, kind of hard. Again, it comes with an asterisk in terms of figuring out how much that's a demonstration of his takedown defense versus how much that's a demonstration of fighting somebody who's just much bigger than you. From when he did get taken down, he did show a high level of urgency and movement to use his guard and prevent Blackshear from doing anything key and establishing any real sort of dangerous top positions. He did kind of struggle a little bit to get back to his feet, but when you think about the way that judges score fights these days, I think that someone like Ricky Simón does not have a very good style for winning fights in the UFC anymore, simply because all he does is slam opponents down on a double leg, and whether or not he's going to be able to do that for 15 minutes without Mario Bautista having moments of success where he can hurt Simón on the return, it's kind of hard to figure it out. So given that Bautista is an underdog here, it does feel like I'm angling towards picking Bautista and maybe betting Bautista, but unfortunately I did catch something as one last sort of opinion as I was wrapping up tape, and it has kind of changed my mind on this fight. Unfortunately, I've noticed that Mario Bautista's ring craft and his footwork is probably what's going to let him down here. So when you watch that Blackshear fight, yeah, there were a lot of moments where Blackshear was attempting takedowns, and whether or not he landed them is what most people are going to focus on. But you have to watch how guilty Mario Bautista was of being pushed backwards and clinched up with far too easily. He struggled to dictate the tempo or the realm of the fight as a result because he just could not create that distance and create that separation for him to land anything on the feet. Blackshear found it so easy to just push him back to the fence and shoot that takedown against the fence or just clinch up, and that's exactly the kind of suffering pressure that Ricky Simón is going to want to bring to this fight to do his best work. Now, once again, there is that question mark of did that happen because Blackshear is so much bigger than Mario Bautista? We don't know for sure, and if it is the case that it was the difference of size, then Mario probably gives a good account of himself here. But if not, Ricky Simón has got that pressure wrestling style that is absolutely going to push his shit in. And if you're not circling and you're not managing your distance, you're not using your jab as a rangefinder and a warning shot, then Ricky Simón's going to eat you alive. And to make matters worse for Mario Bautista, he'd find it so much easier to create that distance and dictate the tempo of the fight if he had power, which is something that Song Yadong did have. That's why Song Yadong didn't struggle with dictating the pace, because anytime Simón got too close to him, he got hit hard in the face. But Mario Bautista's power isn't really as prevalent, and I think therefore he's going to struggle to really assert himself when it comes to that distance control. I think that on paper, skill-wise, Mario Bautista has what it takes to beat a fighter who is one-dimensional like Ricky Simón, but I think that the intensity that Simón brings is going to be enough of a reason for me to believe that the American is going to do what he does here, and Simón's going to find himself getting yet another victory in my mind. I don't think there's any value on the betting line, though, because I do think that Ricky Simón should only be a slight favourite, because Mario Bautista only needs to make a few adjustments or suddenly channel a bit of power to actually change the course of this fight in the blink of an eye, whereas Ricky Simone's path to victory is very likely going to rely on 15 minutes of him doing the exact same rinse and repeat wrestling style. That does make me think that Ricky Simone via decision could be an interesting prop bet, but considering the line on his money line is getting a lot shorter day by day, by the time we actually get props, I imagine that most of the value is probably going to be gone from that selection anyway. So once again, that is a pass from me. I think Ricky Simone should probably be something like a minus 135 favourite, around 58% probability, so there's no value for me on the betting line at present. Next up we have a really exciting one between Phil Hawes and Bruno Ferreira. Phil Hawes is a fighter that I've been very opinionated about in his entire UFC run. I just think that he is a really tragic case. He's a supremely talented athlete, he's got good wrestling, he's got serious knockout power, but unfortunately he's just cursed with a terrible chin and front-runner cardio. The former shows itself a lot more than the latter these days, but both of them are serious red flags that go against him and make him incredibly untrustworthy. You can't trust him early because he might get caught cold, and you can't trust him late because he might gas out. Basically, you can't trust him. On the other hand, Bruno Ferreira is a hard hitter that I don't really think I've seen enough of, but from the very little that I have seen, which is barely 5 minutes of UFC cage time, I don't really rate him as like a competent, well-rounded striker. He just seems very content to stand sort of very stationary, throw, use a lot of feints, a lot of footwork to... He just seems interested in sort of plodding forward, using a lot of feints and a lot of head movement instead of actually sort of throwing any offense. He's very counter-strike based, which obviously worked great against Gregory Rodriguez. But the fact that he just sort of stands there and doesn't really seem particularly interested in giving his opponent a whole lot of things to look at kind of worries me, and obviously that's what happened in the Ruziboyev fight. It took about a minute for Ruziboyev to just make the read, land the straight hand, and then that was it. So in short, I think that this fight is a case of a more skilled fighter versus a more dangerous fighter, and the stakes are obviously heightened because the dangerous fighter is fighting an opponent who is frail. Ferreira's reliance on the KO is usually going to be a tall order, so I don't think he often deserves to be the favourite in many UFC fights from the very little I've seen, but it isn't such a tall order in this one because Hawes is so chinny, it takes a lot less for him to hit that path to victory. On the flip side, if Hawes can do the right things to stay safe in terms of using his grappling and, using his straight shots and the high volume, I think he could put in a pretty commanding and dominant display in this fight and show that he actually is quite a talented fighter as long as he doesn't get put to sleep. Either way, this isn't the kind of fight that I have any interest in from a moneyline perspective. I respect the plausibility of both fighters finding the win here, basically. It's an easy pass for me, and the fight is more or less a pick'em at the moment, which I think kind of validates that opinion. Money has come in the last few weeks. I believe Hawes was around a minus 125 favourite, and now that is Bruno Ferreira's price, which indicates that people are a lot more believing in Ferreira's KO ability and Hawes' chinniness, which I totally understand. I guess if you were going to bet this fight, you might want to go with Bruno Ferreira inside the distance, because I think Hawes should show himself to be competent over 15 minutes, so Bruno probably needs a finish to win here. It's not really something that I'm looking to bet myself, just because I do think this is a coin toss of a fight. But yeah, if you had to bet on a fight, that's probably what I would tell you to go for. It's nothing from me, it's a pass. On to the next one. This card goes from bad to worse, as next up we have Andre Arlovski versus Waldo Cortes-Acosta. I'll just tell you flat out, I did not do tape for this fight. I do not believe that you need to do tape on an Andre Arlovski fight in 2024. I'm very glad that we're starting to see the next stage in Andre Arlovski's decline. We had to sit through years of his half-assed sparring style on the prelims of Apex cards against fat guys. It's just been really boring. Low-level heavyweight is the armpit of the UFC, and the fact that women's MMA gets so much shit when heavyweight MMA is what deserves it really irks me. But anyway, this is just one of those hilarious fights where you've got a guy who, on paper, really should be able to deliver an easy knockout versus a guy who should easily be knocked out. But there's just something about it that just stinks. Like, Waldo Cortes-Acosta is not trustworthy at minus 600 or whatever he is to play executioner for you. I know Andre Arlovski's been knocked out by Marcos Rogerio de Lima and Dontel Mays, and that indicates that Waldo should be able to do it. But this isn't the first time that Waldo's been given a generous fight where he should find a knockout and he has shat the bed and not done it. So he's completely untrustworthy as far as I'm concerned. And without knockout power, Waldo does not have enough to clearly win this fight. If Andre Arlovski goes 15 minutes, I think Andre Arlovski looks like ridiculous value and may actually probably deserve to be the favourite in a 15-minute striking fight if he can keep safe. I'm not saying bet Andrei Arlovski at all in the slightest, but I mean, Andrei Arlovski by decision is probably going to be something like 8-9 to 1, which is a pretty appealing price when you consider that Waldo is being massively overvalued here. But it's not really the kind of bet that I want to be making. If you read my breakdown of my 2023 analysis, I kind of want to start staying away from some of these spots where I feel the line's a little bit wide and I sprinkle on the underdog, who I think has an outside chance. So I will be passing on this fight. I think there's value on Andrei Arlovski here, as ridiculous as it sounds. He could probably end up retiring with a loss, so again, that's another red flag. But I just think that you need to give your head a wobble if you actually think Waldo Cortes-Acosta deserves to be this price. Do not put him in your parlays. It is absolutely not worth it. Leave this fight alone. Don't touch it. On to the next one. And next up, we have a fight that finally I am interested in from a betting perspective, and that is Marcus McGhee versus Gaston Bolanos. So right off the bat, I knew absolutely nothing about Marcus McGhee. So I started off with his LFA win against Luciano Ramos. That was the first fight that I watched. I enjoyed watching him show off his striking ability in that fight, and also with the 2 subsequent UFC bouts that came afterwards. He looks like a really polished and high-level striker. He's got loads of things that you really do like. He's got a variety of straight shots, hooks as well. He throws to the body, throws to the head. He has some spinning attacks, which usually I'm not a huge fan of, but he's sparing with them and doesn't overdo it. So there's a lot to like there, and he did put on a real beating on all 3 of those opponents, and I was impressed. Impressed with an asterisk, though, really, because they are all fighters I would describe as warm bodies on the feet, i.e. they're just punching bags. They didn't have a whole lot of threatening offense to provide on the return, so they just sort of stood there and absorbed pretty much Marcus McGhee in his highlight reel. Journey Newsom's probably the best of the 3. And he's a fighter that I actually do think is slightly better than his UFC record would indicate. He's currently 1-4 in the organisation, but he's had a couple of competitive fights in there. I think he did give someone like Ricardo Ramos a bit of a fair showing, and he's quite a well-rounded opponent. So he's somebody that I would look at as, if you can really beat him confidently, then you kind of do demonstrate that you deserve to be at UFC level and that you're worth the contract that you've been given. And to be fair to Marcus McGhee, whilst the opposition may have been low, he did exactly what was expected of him. So, in conclusion, I would look at Marcus McGhee as somebody who has a lot of potential, and if he can actually do that against a UFC caliber fighter, then consider me excited. Obviously, that is a bit of a big if, because we still don't know how he's going to be when he's tested against somebody who can throw back. But I actually don't think that really matters here, because he's fighting Gaston Bolanos. Gaston Bolanos' only UFC outing so far was against Aaron Phillips, who I believe was a fighter who was fighting in like the Reebok era, maybe even before the Reebok era of the UFC, and took a massive amount of time off and then suddenly came back during COVID. It was a very strange return. But Aaron Phillips is a really bad striker who's only really excelled in the grappling departments in his career. He's been pieced up by quite a few dudes over the years. So Bolanos looked clearly better on the feet in that fight against Phillips. But once again, I was kind of struggling to know how much stock to put into that because, again, I would describe Aaron Phillips as a warm body. And to be honest, I didn't really think Bolanos was that impressive considering he was fighting somebody that he should have been able to really style on the feet. He was using his leg kick as a main primary offense, which, you know, obviously it's a useful thing to utilize, and I said that about Johnny Walker against Ankalaev in the main event, but you can't have it as like 90% of your offense, which is what he used it for at a pretty high clip. There were some straight shots in there too, but honestly I think that was quite a limiting offense that somebody the level of Marcus McGhee should be able to look at, absorb, download the data, and like just turn it on him in about 2 minutes. Aside from that, I looked at a couple of other Gaston Bolanos fights. It was actually quite hard to find tape because Bellator put their stuff in quite hard to reach places. And the other clips I found were him just sort of struggling or just looking bang average again with some strange shot selection against pretty average competition on Bellator. So yeah, I just wasn't impressed. So really, when I look at a fight like this, I think you've got two guys who are going to want to do the same thing, which is strike, but you've got complete different levels in terms of like the dangerousness, the overall technicality, and the minute winning ability. And I think those are clearly in favour of McGhee. There are obviously some concerns about McGhee's level of competition, and I am a bit dubious that he may actually not be anywhere as good as I think he could be, but I don't think this is the fight for that to be exposed, and I think this is just another opportunity for Marcus McGhee to style on an opponent and look really good. So for that reason, I chose him as my second leg in a parlay with Jasmine Jasudavicius in the UFC 297 pay-per-view next week. And this was one of the bets that I teased late last year where I said I was really confident in Jasudavicius and was using her as a parlay leg. I just needed to find the other half, and that other half is Marcus McGhee. So that's a 3-unit bet. It comes to minus 125. And yeah, looking forward to hopefully cashing that with relative ease.
So next up, we have one of the shorter notice fights on the card between Matthew Semelsberger and Preston Parsons. It's a really interesting turn of events for me because I've gone from wanting to bet on Preston Parsons against Basil Hafez to wanting to bet Matthew Semelsberger here. That's a testament to how important stylistic matchups are in MMA, and I think Parsons had a really good opportunity against a fellow grappler like Hafez to show what he actually can do well, but now he's got an uphill battle against a pure striker in Matthew Semelsberger. I'm a big Matthew Semelsberger fan. I've bet on him a bunch of times, and I really like his striking style. We've even talked on social media a little bit about his Doomtree tattoo, which was just a random thing that I saw when he made his debut. Really cool guy, and I'm always rooting for him. He seems like one of the nice guys in MMA. I do really wish that he'd pumped the brakes on his career a little bit, though, because we've seen that he has some obvious grappling deficiencies, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. It would be wise for him to spend a little bit more time developing those skills and getting a little bit better there at a better gym than his local one, which is where it seems like he's done his whole training for his entire UFC career. The guy just seems committed to riding his UFC contract until the wheels fall off, which, you know, given the amount that the fighters get paid on the lower half of the prelims, I can kind of understand it, but it would just be nice to see him invest a little bit smarter in his career. So those grappling deficiencies, they are a key topic in this fight because Preston Parsons is a wrestler and we fully expect him to land a couple of takedowns and have some success time with them. In a way, this fight should closely resemble Semelsberger's fight with Jeremiah Wells recently, where he dominated on the feet and scored 2 knockdowns and had Wells in all sorts of trouble anytime they were striking. But he also spent about 11 minutes of the fight being controlled, which is obviously a very hard thing to ignore when you consider who wins. I bet Semi in that fight, and personally I think it was a little bit of a robbery because we're supposed to be scoring on damage primarily, and the guy who scored 2 knockdowns and almost won the fight lost to a guy who had double the amount of winning minutes but did nothing really except a couple of slams and working in full guard and just didn't really threaten that much. So yeah, that was a bit frustrating, but I think the exact same logic really kind of applies to this one. It is hard to address that fight using the same losing logic on Semelsberger and then saying that it should get him the win against Parsons, but I think there are some clear differences in the capabilities of Jeremiah Wells and Preston Parsons. Firstly, cardio. It appears to be a bit of an issue for Parsons. He doesn't seem capable of delivering a wrestling performance for 15 minutes without his success sort of diminishing as the fight wears on, especially considering he's going up against somebody like Semelsberger who is going to have the tenacity to scramble and try to get back to his feet, which means that Parsons is going to have to start again from scratch with that entry and all of the other grappling work from the beginning from standing. We've also seen Parsons get reversed and swept when he has had top control, and I don't really think his top control is amazing. It's not bad, and it probably would be enough to hold Semelsberger down for a good couple of minutes, but I don't really think we're going to see anything super impressive in terms of finishing ability or ground and pound striking. I think it should just be a case of control time and nothing else, which shouldn't be enough to get you the win on the judges' scorecard. So those differences in striking are pretty huge here in my opinion, and definitely the biggest gap in skill across the entire fight. I think Semelsberger could low-key be one of the hardest pound-for-pound hitters in the UFC because whenever he lands clean, he seems to cause knockdowns or at least damage his opponent pretty much every time. He has 10 knockdowns in 9 fights, which is a pretty insane statistic when you think about it, especially considering the weight class they're fighting in isn't like the heaviest in the UFC. Parsons, on the other hand, his striking is pretty bad. He's pretty hittable himself. It very much seems like a means to an end and that he's not really trying to actually do damage. He's more just sort of wanting to confuse his opponent and get their guard up so that he can find that single or double leg. Defensively, as I said, he's hittable. He's also quite flat-footed, which is going to make it quite easy for Semelsberger to land clean with those straight shots that he loves, which are a really reliable weapon and always a primary skill set that I like strikers that I bet on to use. I also don't think that Parsons sets up his takedowns particularly well. A lot of the time they do seem quite telegraphed. They come from nowhere. He shoots them naked, as they say, which I think could give Semelsberger an opportunity to find a quick counter with an uppercut or a knee or something along those lines. You know, if this fight takes place entirely on the feet, Semelsberger probably ends up looking minus 500, which is kind of insane to say given where the betting line is currently. So yeah, in regards to that betting line, I think Semelsberger should definitely be the favourite for the exact same reasons that I bet on him to win the Jeremiah Wells fight. The judging incompetence does spook me a little bit because I am using logic that didn't quite work out in that last fight. I'm aware of that. but I don't think that Parsons is going to be able to do what Jeremiah Wells did. So if Semi the Jedi almost got the job done there, I think he should be good here. There's also a chance that Semelsberger obviously ends it before the scorecards even get read, because he is obviously a very hard hitter. So that's another added bonus. Semelsberger probably should be about minus 175 in my opinion, which gives me some clear value given that he's currently around minus 125 across all the books. So yeah, I like the value that's available there. It's like 9%, I think it is. So I'm absolutely going to take that. Because I am aware that Parsons has a skill set that can test Matthew's weaknesses, I am going to go a bit easy on the stakes. So that'll be a 1.5 unit bet for me on Semelsberger to win at minus 125. I'll also be keeping an eye out for the KO price, because I'd be interested in it if it was like plus 200 or better, but I'm not sure it will be. If it is, and if I do like the price, I might not pull the trigger, but if I do, it'll be a 0.5 unit bet, bringing it to 2 units on Semelsberger in total. And in the next fight, we have one of the most exciting bouts on the card. We have Farid Basharat versus Taylor Lapilus. So I was really impressed with Farid Basharat's last UFC performance where he beat Clayton Rodriguez, because up to that point I was beginning to suspect that he was going to confirm himself as the shit sibling. For those of you who don't know, there's this narrative in MMA that's existed for like at least a decade, when you have two siblings or two family members who are involved in MMA in a high organization, one of them ends up being good and the other one ends up being pretty crap. It's very rare that they're both very good. And I was beginning to think that Farid Basharat was going to apply to that as well, with his brother Javid, who's sensational. And the reason that I felt that way was because I thought Basharat was really underwhelming in that Damon Blackshear fight that he had just 2 fights ago. I had him in a parlay at like minus 350 for that fight, and to be honest, I wouldn't really have minded if the judges had given the fight to Damon Blackshear instead. It was that close. It was just a grappling fest, and I know Damon Blackshear has shown himself to be a much better fighter and a much better grappler than initially gave him credit for in that fight. But I would have thought that the Farid Basharat that beat Clayton Rodriguez would have been able to really style on Damon Blackshear across all levels of MMA. So I do think he kind of underwhelmed in that performance, and I was beginning to go off him, but he was right back at it, showing off how good he can be against Clayton. Here he faces Taylor Lapilus, who is another strange case, because he's made his return to the UFC after a bit of time in other organisations, and I assume it was because he didn't re-sign his contract. He was 3-1 at the time in the UFC when he actually left, which is quite rare that you see fighters do that, but good for him. He's a pure striker as well, which is another reason I was surprised that he got rid of, because it's not like he's boring. It's not like he's a boring fighter. And his game is really nice to watch. He's got some really fluid striking, and it's just such a joy to watch how he utilises his jab and just invests in it often. I often say that I think that that's one of the marks of a really intelligent fighter in MMA, because the jab is a weapon that's like sometimes completely underutilized by fighters, and you'll see some guys who lead with lead hooks or just hooks in general instead of just sitting behind a jab and just pinging their opponent for 15 whole minutes. It can win you a fight. I mean, look at Sean Strickland. But back to Lapilus, I think that from what we've seen of him in his brief UFC appearances, and most recently against Cal Loughran, I think you can kind of argue that he probably has the striking advantage in this fight. Not to say that Farid Basharat is a bad striker by any means, but I just think that Lapilus has the tools to make life very difficult for Farid. However, that only tells half the story, as Lapilus's grappling is clearly a weakness of his, given he has that kickboxing background and he's French. That's not surprising at all. And to be honest, the reason for this betting line and the reason that Farid is probably going to be in a lot of parlays this week is that you really would be expecting Farid to utilise that grappling disadvantage in the same way that he did against Clayton Rodriguez. We saw Loughran try his best to get something out of Taylor Lapilus on the mat, but the Frenchman was mostly up to the task of stuffing the takedowns and getting back to his feet. But I wasn't really that impressed with his get-up game once he did get taken down. There was a lot of shrimping back to the fence and trying to wall walk back upwards, but it wasn't really sort of explosive or urgent or full of technique, the same way that Alex Pereira looks when he gets taken down to the mat. You can tell that there's not a whole lot of process and thought going into the series of how to get back to your feet, as opposed to just sort of like using force. So yeah, I think I was impressed enough from what I saw from Farid in that Clayton fight that I do expect him to be able to use his grappling and get the job done quite easily here. However, I do think that Lapilus should be able to keep the fight quite close on the feet, and honestly, if Basharat decides that he wants to test his striking a little bit more, this one could get ugly for him and suddenly he could fumble it as a decent favourite. Currently, I think Basharat sits at around minus 250, and he was like minus 175 around December 2023 time when the betting line was originally dropped. I did kind of wait to do my tape for this one for quite some time, and by that point he was around minus 200, minus 225, so personally,
I feel like I just missed the boat on all the value, and it doesn't really sit right with me betting on a fighter when you've seen the best line go. It always feels like you're kind of playing catch up and you're betting it for the fear of missing out, as opposed to your actual genuine desire to want to bet the fighter for their own credentials. So personally with me, when I look at this line, I think it probably should sit somewhere in the middle. Minus 200 feels about right for me, because whilst I do think Farid Basharat has a clear advantage, I just have this sneaking suspicion that Lapilus can make this look close very easily if we see a lot more moments on the feet. And trusting a fighter to go to their grappling when they've got a really appealing and respected opponent in front of them, sometimes they just let you down in that regard. And at minus 250, I really would not want to trust Farid to do that. So whilst I do expect him to win and I do expect him to be quite dominant with his grappling, I don't want to get involved in this one, so I won't be betting Farid Basharat. But personally, at minus 250, I don't really mind it if you want to put him in parlays. There are a lot worse options on the card to go for, but for me, it's no bet. And in the next fight, I'll make this one quick. We have Jean Silva versus Weston Wilson. I'm assuming that his name is pronounced Jean, because I honestly haven't done any tape on the guy, so I have no idea what we're getting here. The reason I haven't done any tape is that there's absolutely no point in looking at Silva, considering he's like a minus 800 favourite against Weston Wilson. I did do a bit of tape on Wilson to see if he had any redeeming qualities, and it didn't take long before I realised he is a role player who is just attempting to be Wonder Boy, but he's got completely the wrong frame to be that kind of like evasive karate fighter, and he also doesn't have very good head movement, which is the difference. He keeps his hands low because he's hopping around trying to look cool, but he's also got tall man's defense, which means that he's super easy to hit and his hands aren't there to protect him, which means it's probably very easy to get finish over him. On the mat, he's a fighter who likes to roll for leg locks instead of protecting himself, which we saw in his UFC debut, which made him a very easy guy to finish considering he was a sitting duck and again wasn't defending himself. Basically a dream debut for someone like Jean Silva. As I said, I didn't look into Silva at all because he's too short of a favourite and he's a bit of a finisher. So unless you're playing contrarian and trying to bet on something like over 1.5 rounds or Silva to win by decision, the prices that you would be looking towards would be that KO round 1, KO in round 1, stuff like that. The books have juiced those lines to shit because the price on his money line is so short that all of the other prices have to be short as well. So unless you're trying to play contrarian and do something a little different and think outside the box and try and be clever, there will not be a plus EV bet on this fight, just objectively. That's the way it works in MMA when you have a favourite who's about minus 800. It's an easy pass. There's no need to think about this one anymore. Don't put it in parlays. What do you know about Jean Silva that means that he should be minus 800 here? No, just don't do it. Leave it alone. And as we wind down to the first couple of fights on the card, we have another one of those short notice fights between Felipe Bunes and Joshua Van. Joshua Van is the one stepping up on short notice after, I believe it was Dennis Bondar who pulled out of the Bunes fight. Van is starting to look like a really interesting and exciting fighter in my eyes. I think his performance against Kevin Borjas showed that he has technique, skill and output to be a force in the striking department in the UFC. And the guy's just 22 years old, which means the rest of his game is going to be developing to catch up to that. Very exciting prospect, to be honest. So he faces Felipe Bunes, who, I don't know if it's Bunes or Bunes, I can't remember. So he makes his UFC debut here. I enjoyed watching his regional scene. It was honestly just fun to watch. He's a diverse fighter. He's obviously a lot more offensively capable than he is defensively. But like I said, it was entertaining to watch. He throws a variety of shots on the feet, lots of spinning attacks, way too many spinning attacks. And as I said earlier, that's not something I'm a fan of. I just think it puts you off balance, it makes you susceptible to a takedown, and it actually cost him the fight against Jussier Formiga. It does have to be said that Jussier Formiga result was concerning to me. Bunes has kind of shown us where his ceiling is already. He's barely got a 50-50 record, and he hasn't fought for a major organisation yet. So to show that you're struggling and you've not even made it to the big leagues is pretty shocking. So when he does get that step up against Jussier Formiga, who used to be big leagues and was 37 years old at the time that they fought, he'd just been axed from the UFC. He had a 9-7 record in the UFC by the end of it. It just seems like the kind of opportunity that it's like, if you want to make it to the big show, this is exactly the kind of guy you want to be. If you can show that you're better than who's going out the door, they should let you through the door. And I know that Formiga's still good, and he did fight 3 killers on his way to getting cut, but it does kind of highlight that you're a bit of a busted prospect if you can't beat him. And I'm sorry, once I saw that, it really was hard for me to look at Felipe Bunes the same way. I think also the matchmakers are very aware of that. It says a lot about the matchmakers' perception of Bunes that they were willing to make this fight in the first place. They were giving him a generous springboard to start his UFC career against Dennis Bondar, who is obviously a disgraced, busted prospect who's not going to be in the UFC in a year's time, considering he lost to Malcolm Gordon. I know he lost by an injury, but he was losing that fight to Malcolm Gordon. And the fact that the UFC have sort of turned around and used Felipe Bunes to springboard Joshua Van instead. It kind of shows that they weren't really that keen on using Bunes to be like a prospect or be anything useful to the UFC. I think he was probably just going to be a fun fighter that they wanted to get on the board. But now that they have the opportunity to actually sort of polish the record of Joshua Van, who is somebody that I imagine they are very excited about, it just kind of tells me that there's no faith there in Felipe Bunes. And honestly, I don't know why there would be, given that he has already shown that he's just not got what it takes. Stylistically as well, I think that just that recklessness, there's obviously a dangerousness to that, and people are going to have to be careful against Bunes because he can surprise you with the spinning attacks and with that just explosiveness and wildness that he has. But Joshua Van is just so cool, calm and collected in the cage. I think he's just going to be one step ahead at every single moment. He's going to be the one landing the crisper, the cleaner and the more impactful shots, picking apart somebody who has weaker defense and is just a lot more flat-footed and a lot more predictable once their wildness shows to not work for them. So I think there's a lot of upside for Joshua Van here. I was very surprised by this line. I wrote all of this analysis before the line came out, and I think I predicted Joshua Van to be minus 300. And on a full camp, I would have said probably minus 400. So I did factor in the fact that he's coming in on short notice. I think it opened at around minus 250, which I was going to get involved with a bet, and that was initially going to be what I did combine with Jasmine Jasudavicius. But then I noticed that the line started moving the other way, and somehow the betting public have pushed Joshua Van to minus 190, which to me I think is insane, and I think is really great value. I know everyone's not a huge fan of playing numbers that are near minus 200 as straight bets, but for me I think it's a really good one. So I've got 3 units on Joshua Van at minus 188. And I am really confident with it going into this card. I obviously don't have a whole lot of bets on this card, so for me to have something like that in the prelims, for that to come along last minute was like really lucky, and I'm very grateful for it. So yeah, I think Joshua Van should be minus 300 here. I'm very confident in him. I think he's a great parlay leg if that's the way you want to play it. Joshua Van all day. And finally, we have Nicolas Motta versus Tom Nolan. This is going to be a bit of a painful one for me to go through because if you've been reading any of my stuff or listening to this podcast for the last few weeks, you'll remember I had a small bet on Trey Ogden to beat Nicolas Motta as a plus 125 underdog, I think it was. I think I just was on an island as the only person who seemed to have any faith in Trey Ogden that day. And Trey Ogden went and looked minus 300. He was absolutely sensational. And I was so proud of myself midway through that fight, thinking, I'm a genius. I'm going to look great when everyone reads this back, etc., etc. And then round 3 happened, and with a couple of minutes left in the fight, it was declared a no contest, which was obviously very frustrating, but for a multitude of reasons that transcends just that fight itself. Obviously, I didn't get paid on a winning bet that I really should have been paid. The books didn't have to pay the price for the mistake they made in pricing it wrong, but they also got a get out of jail free card because they now know that Nicolas Motta is really shit enough to lose to Trey Ogden. So they're going to put him at an absolutely atrocious price against somebody like Tom Nolan, despite the fact that we don't know anything about Tom Nolan. Because I can tell you now, if Motta versus Ogden had never happened in the first place, I think Motta would be a favourite here. But instead, he's like plus 175. So I'm having to try hard not to let my frustration over that ordeal make me bet Tom Nolan here. Because I just want the money that I should have got from fading Motta. Like, I obviously deserve it. So I feel like my brain is telling me to just hammer Tom Nolan here. But in all honesty, from what I saw, I don't think he's the guy for it. He's got an absolutely massive frame for the division, don't get me wrong, and honestly that's going to be a challenge and an intimidating thing for anyone. Motta's not the biggest guy either for the weight class. Tom Nolan's like 6'3", which is absolutely huge. The size advantage is going to be big, but honestly, the thing that really frustrates me about a fighter like Tom Nolan is that he doesn't use that size to his advantage. He's somebody who wants to get in close, crash the pocket, and swing for the fences against you. At least that's what we saw in his Dana White Contender Series fight, which it's a useful tactic, but it's not something you should be doing if you're 6'3" and towering over everybody else. You need to fight long. You need to be at a range where you can hit your opponent and they can't hit you without taking a huge risk. And that's just not how Tom Nolan fights. So yeah, in short, I'm kind of struggling to see what Tom Nolan himself brings to the table to be minus 250 here. I feel like this betting line is clearly just a reflection of the books trying to amend their mistake on Nicolas Motta and give us a shit price on him because everyone's going to be trying to back Tom Nolan because Motta basically weaseled his way out of a genuine loss. Also on the reverse, like if you do want to think about how Nicolas Motta might win this fight, it's exactly the way that Tom Nolan is going to give it to him. If Nolan comes in, crashing the pocket and wants to swing for the fences in close, the shorter and lesser reach of Nicolas Motta is going to benefit from that because he's going to be within range to land shots himself. And Nicolas Motta does have power, so it is a genuine concern. So you can back Tom Nolan if you want. I understand him being the favourite here because I do think that the size is going to be very hard to overcome. He's obviously an unknown prospect from Dana White's Contender Series, and we all hate Nicolas Motta at the moment. But the price is way too steep for me, considering we haven't actually seen Tom Nolan do much that's merit of himself that doesn't have anything to do with Nicolas Motta. So I'm going to leave it alone. Reminisce on better days. Think about those first 2 rounds of Trey Ogden absolutely bossing Motta, and just remember the good times instead of trying hard to put money in spots I don't want to put it in. So no bet for me on Tom Nolan. I advise you pass, but I kind of think everyone's going to be cramming into parlays this week. Hopefully it plays off for you, but I'm kind of hoping Nicolas Motta pulls it off so that I can just laugh, but that's just me. I'm an arsehole. Anyway, yeah, I would say it should probably be minus 150 Tom Nolan plus 150 Nicolas Motta, which obviously means there's not really any value on either side. It's a pass from me. Nothing for this fight. So there we are. That is the entire UFC Vegas 84 card broken down from a betting perspective. I'm sorry it's not a particularly exciting one, and I'm sorry there aren't a whole lot of bets off the back of it, but I'm not going to force it. If I don't see a bet that I like, I won't play it. I do promise that next week will be more interesting, the UFC 297 pay-per-view. I do have a lot of bets on that one and a lot more opinions. Obviously, it's a higher caliber card, so we have a lot more reasons to be confident with available tape, whereas here, lots of heavy favourites and not a lot of UFC experience amongst them. So just to summarise, I have 3 bets on the card and probably won't be adding any more. Those are 3 units on Joshua Van at minus 188, 1.5 units on Matthew Semelsberger at minus 125, and 3 units on a parlay of Marcus McGhee and Jasmine Jasudavicius, both to win. That's at minus 125. As always, I always list some parlay pieces, the picks that I do think should be included in parlays. This isn't going to be a massive number this week because I don't think there are lots of them. Those are Marcus McGhee, Joshua Van, Hawes and Ferreira doesn't go the distance, Motta and Nolan doesn't go the distance, and Matthew Semelsberger moneyline. And I also do a dog of the week, but honestly, I'm going to pass on it this week. It was originally going to be Jim Miller, but since I wrote that, he's moved into minus 110, which means it's a pure pick'em, so that's not really an underdog anymore. So I don't have a dog of the week. Sorry. I'll catch you next week at UFC 297. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. Please let me know what you think. If there's anything I can do better, anything that you do like that I do, please comment. It's, always good feedback. I take it on board. I'm not going to be hostile about it. I know I'm new to this game. I've only done like 4 podcasts. I listen to quite a few, but I'm always a work in progress with everything that I do. So engagement is good. Let me know. Give me a subscribe if you want. Give it a like, whatever. I don't really know if I care about that stuff. But yeah, I'll catch you next week.